Part 1. Dust and Determination. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust that made Catherine cough into her handkerchief. Through the grimy window, she glimpsed wooden buildings baking under the Wyoming sun, their paint weathered to gray by wind and alkali dust. This was Clearwater, her new home, whether she was ready or not. "End of the line, miss," the driver called as he climbed down to retrieve her trunk. Catherine gathered her skirts and stepped carefully onto the wooden sidewalk, immediately feeling the difference between Boston's cobblestones and these rough frontier planks. The heat struck her like a physical blow, and she touched her chignon to ensure it hadn't already begun escaping its pins. A tall man in work clothes approached, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair that caught the light. His blue-gray eyes held a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as he took in her Eastern dress and obvious inexperience with frontier conditions. "You'd be the new schoolteacher," he said, his voice carrying a Western drawl that marked him as clearly local. "I am Catherine Whitmore," she replied, extending her gloved hand with the formal courtesy her Boston upbringing demanded. "Jake Morrison," he responded, accepting her handshake briefly before gesturing toward her heavy trunk. "That looks like it contains half of Boston. You planning to stay long?" The question carried an undertone suggesting he doubted her commitment, which immediately raised Catherine's defenses. "I plan to stay as long as the children of this community need proper education." Jake's slight smile suggested amusement at her certainty. "The last teacher from back east lasted 3 weeks before she caught the next stage out. Course, she didn't have quite your confidence." "Perhaps she lacked proper preparation," Catherine said, watching him effortlessly lift her trunk of carefully selected textbooks and supplies. "I've come here with specific educational goals, not romantic notions about frontier adventure." "Education goals," Jake repeated thoughtfully as they walked toward the small building that served as both schoolhouse and church. "What kind of goals work out here, Miss Whitmore?" Catherine surveyed the dusty street, the rough-dressed men lounging outside the saloon, and the general air of barely controlled lawlessness. Every child deserves to read, write, and understand mathematics. Beyond that, literature and history provide moral guidance and broader perspectives. "Moral guidance," Jake said, stopping in front of the schoolhouse. "You might want to see what kind of moral guidance we've been getting lately." He opened the door to reveal a simple room with rough benches, a pot-bellied stove, and her prized chalkboard. But what drew Catherine's attention immediately were the bullet holes scattered across the back wall, their edges splintered and fresh. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Previous teacher tried to assign essays about local business practices," Jake explained, his tone becoming more serious. "Some folks around here don't appreciate too many questions about where money comes from or how it gets spent." Catherine studied the damage, feeling her resolve harden rather than weaken. "Are you suggesting I should avoid teaching critical thinking skills?" "I'm suggesting you might want to consider whether dying for grammar lessons is worth it," Jake replied bluntly. "There's a stage back east tomorrow morning." "Mr. Morrison," Catherine said, turning to face him directly, "I did not travel 1,500 miles to be intimidated by local bullies. These children deserve better than ignorance, and this community deserves better than lawlessness disguised as business." Jake's expression shifted to something approaching respect. "You're either braver or more foolish than most Eastern ladies." "Perhaps both," Catherine admitted, running her fingers along the bullet holes. "But I'm certainly more stubborn than most people expect." Part 2. Lessons and Learning. 2 weeks into the school term, Catherine had established a routine that began before sunrise and ended well after sunset. The frontier children proved eager learners despite their limited previous education, and she found herself adapting her teaching methods to include practical skills alongside classical subjects. Jake appeared at the schoolhouse most evenings as she cleaned the chalkboard and prepared the next day's lessons. Initially, she'd assumed these visits were purely protective, checking for signs of trouble from the outlaws who'd threatened her predecessor. Gradually, she realized his interest extended beyond mere security, teaching them to read cattle brands as part of reading lessons. Jake observed, examining the chalkboard where she'd written various ranch marks alongside alphabet exercises. That's clever thinking. Education should serve practical needs while expanding intellectual horizons, Catherine replied, organizing her lesson materials. Young Tommy Morrison reads ranch records better than some adults now. Tommy's my nephew, Jake said with obvious pride. His father runs the general store, always struggled with keeping books organized. The boy's been helping him with inventory since you taught him proper arithmetic. Catherine felt warm satisfaction at this evidence of her teaching's practical impact. Mathematics provides foundation for countless life applications, though I admit I've learned as much from these children as they have from me. Such as? Jake asked, settling onto one of the student benches with casual ease that made the rough furniture seem almost comfortable. Frontier weather patterns, local geography, and the social dynamics that keep communities functioning despite obvious challenges, Catherine said, taking the seat across from him. Also, that formal grammar matters less than clear communication when you're trying to reach people. You've changed your teaching style considerably, Jake observed. First week, you sounded like you were lecturing Harvard professors. Catherine laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its genuine warmth. I discovered that insisting on perfect pronunciation of Latin terms doesn't help children who need to learn practical English first. But you haven't given up on the important things, Jake said, gesturing toward the poetry collection she'd brought from Boston. Sarah Jenkins recited that Longfellow poem for her parents last night. First time I've seen her father smile since his wife passed last spring. Literature provides comfort and connection across all experiences, Catherine said softly, especially in, difficult circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by young Billy Preston running breathlessly to the schoolhouse. "Miss Catherine," he called, "Ma says there's strangers asking questions about you at the store. Rough-looking men wanting to know how long you're planning to stay." Jake's expression immediately hardened, and he stood with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to potential danger. "How many men, Billy?" "3 that I saw," the boy replied, glancing nervously between his teacher and the man who'd become her unofficial protector. "Ma said they didn't seem friendly." "Thank you for telling us, Billy," Catherine said calmly, though she felt her pulse quicken. "You should head home now, and please tell your mother I appreciate her concern." After the boy left, Jake turned to Catherine with obvious worry. "This is what I was afraid of. The same pattern that drove off the last teacher." "What exactly do these men want?" Catherine asked, maintaining her composure despite the implied threat. "Control," Jake replied grimly. "They run smuggling operations through the territory, using local businesses as cover. Educated kids ask questions, want to know why certain shipments come through at odd hours, why some folks have money that doesn't match their visible work." Catherine considered this information, understanding for the first time the real nature of the danger she faced. So they prefer ignorant populations that don't notice illegal activities. "Exactly," Jake confirmed, "and they've made it clear they'll do whatever necessary to maintain that ignorance." "Then," Catherine said, squaring her shoulders with determination, "we'd better make sure these children learn to ask even better questions." Part 3. Deepening Bonds. A month later, Catherine had not only survived the initial threats, but gained genuine acceptance from most of the community. Parents who'd initially doubted an Eastern teacher now praised her practical approach and the visible improvement in their children's skills. Jake's evening visits had evolved from protective surveillance to anticipated conversations that both treasured. "You've never seen the country from up high," Jake said one Saturday afternoon as Catherine finished organizing her weekly supplies. "There's a view from the rim rock that might change how you see this land." "I should prepare tomorrow's lessons," Catherine replied, though her tone suggested she was tempted by the invitation. "Lessons can wait an hour," Jake said with gentle persuasion. "Besides, understanding the geography helps with teaching it." Catherine found herself agreeing, and soon they were riding toward the bluffs that overlooked the valley. Jake had provided a gentle mare and basic instruction in Western riding, noting with approval how quickly she adapted to the different saddle and techniques. From the rim rock, the harsh frontier landscape revealed unexpected beauty. Rolling grassland stretched toward snow-capped mountains, with the creek winding silver through green bottomland where cattle grazed peacefully. "It's magnificent," Catherine said softly, understanding for the first time why people chose this difficult life. "I never imagined such vastness and grandeur." "Most folks from back east only see the hardships," Jake replied, dismounting to help her down from her horse. "They miss the freedom and the possibility of building something real." Standing close together on the high overlook, Catherine became acutely aware of Jake's strength and gentleness, the way he moved with quiet confidence in this environment that had once seemed so foreign to her. When he pointed out landmarks and explained the seasonal patterns that governed ranch life, she found herself watching his face as much as listening to his words. "Jake," she said during a pause in his descriptions, "why did you leave the cavalry?" His expression grew distant, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Orders that conflicted with what I thought was right," he said finally. "Too much violence against people who were just protecting their families and homes." "Is that why you're so protective of the school?" Catherine asked gently. "Because education represents something worth defending?" "Maybe," Jake admitted, meeting her eyes directly. "Or maybe because watching you stand up to those threats reminds me that some things are worth fighting for." The intensity in his voice made Catherine's breath catch, and she realized their relationship had moved far beyond teacher and protector. "Jake, Riders coming fast," he interrupted, his attention suddenly focused on the valley below. 3 men heading straight for town." Catherine shaded her eyes, following his gaze to see the dust cloud that marked approaching horsemen. "The same men who were asking questions?" "Likely," Jake said grimly, helping her mount her horse with quick efficiency. "We need to get back." As they rode toward town, Catherine felt her peaceful afternoon shatter into anxiety about what new threats awaited. But alongside the fear, she also felt a growing certainty that whatever came next, she wanted to face it with Jake beside her. "Whatever they're planning," she said as they neared the outskirts of Clearwater, "I'm not leaving." Jake's smile carried both admiration and worry. "I didn't figure you would. Just promise me you'll be careful." "Only if you promise the same," Catherine replied, realizing that her concern for his safety matched his protective instincts toward her. Part 4. Standing together. The confrontation came 3 days later, just as Catherine dismissed the afternoon students. The 3 strangers Jake had spotted approached the schoolhouse with the deliberate swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others through reputation and implied violence. "Miss Whitmore?" the leader called, his voice carrying false politeness that barely concealed underlying menace. "We hear you're planning to stay in Clearwater permanently." Catherine stepped onto the schoolhouse porch, maintaining dignified composure despite her racing pulse. "I plan to continue teaching as long as the community supports education." "That's unfortunate," the man replied, spitting tobacco juice that splattered dangerously close to her feet. "This town's been getting along fine without fancy book learning. Folks here prefer practical knowledge. Reading, writing, and arithmetic hardly qualify as impractical," Catherine said calmly, though she noticed the men positioning themselves to block her retreat into the building. "Depends what you're reading about," another man said with ugly emphasis. "Some subjects are better left alone in a community like this." Before Catherine could respond, Jake's voice cut through the tension from behind the men. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Something I can help you with?" The strangers turned to face him, and Catherine saw their casual arrogance shift to wariness as they recognized his calm readiness for violence. Jake's hand rested naturally near his gun belt, but his stance suggested confidence rather than aggression. "This is between us and the schoolteacher," the leader said, attempting to maintain control of the situation. "Anything concerning Miss Whitmore concerns me," Jake replied evenly, "especially when 3 armed men feel the need to discuss education policy with a lady." "You're Morrison," the second man said with recognition. "Heard you used to be cavalry. Also heard you mind your own business these days." "Miss Whitmore's safety is my business," Jake said, moving slightly to position himself between Catherine and the strangers. "And the school serves this community's children, which makes it everyone's business." Catherine stepped forward, refusing to hide behind Jake's protection despite the obvious danger. "Gentlemen, if you have concerns about my teaching methods, I invite you to attend a school board meeting where such matters are properly discussed." "There won't be any more school board meetings," the leader said, his false politeness finally dropping away entirely. "Because there won't be any more school. You've got until tomorrow to pack your bags and catch the eastbound stage." "And if I refuse?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "Then you'll discover that frontier accidents happen to people who don't listen to good advice," the man replied with unmistakable threat. Jake's response was immediate and decisive. "And you'll discover that threatening women and children brings consequences you might not survive." The tension stretched taut between the two groups, with violence seeming inevitable until the sound of approaching footsteps broke the standoff. Several townspeople emerged from nearby buildings: the blacksmith, the store owner, and 3 ranchers who'd been in town for supplies. "Problem here, Jake?" asked Tom Preston, Billy's father, carrying a shotgun with casual competence. "These gentlemen were just leaving," Jake replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Faced with unexpected community solidarity, the strangers retreated with muttered threats about consequences for interfering with their business. As they rode away, Catherine realized she was trembling with reaction to the confrontation. "You did well," Jake said quietly, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in comfort. "Standing up to them took real courage." "I was terrified," Catherine admitted, surprised by her honesty. "Courage isn't not being scared," Tom Preston observed, approaching with obvious respect. "It's doing what's right despite being scared, and teaching our kids despite threats like that, that's real courage." The other townspeople murmured agreement, and Catherine realized that the confrontation had actually strengthened community support for her and the school. But she also understood that the threats would escalate, and that her choice to stay would put others at risk. "Jake," she said after the crowd dispersed, "I can't let my presence endanger innocent people." "And I can't let you face this alone," he replied firmly. "We're stronger together, Catherine, both in dealing with these threats and in building the kind of community worth protecting." Part 5. Choosing the Future. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later when the outlaws attempted to burn the schoolhouse during a community meeting about expanding educational services. Jake and several ranchers had anticipated such escalation and were prepared with an organized defense that drove off the attackers permanently. Standing in the dawn light surveying the attempted damage, minimal thanks to their preparation, Catherine felt a profound shift in her understanding of what home meant. The bullet holes that had once frightened her now seemed like badges of honor, proof that this community valued education enough to fight for it. The territorial governor sending a U.S. Marshal to investigate the smuggling operation, Jake reported, joining her on the schoolhouse steps. Those men won't be troubling anyone around here again. Good, Catherine said, surprised by the fierce satisfaction she felt. The children deserve to learn without fear, and their teacher deserves to live without constantly looking over her shoulder, Jake added, settling beside her with comfortable familiarity. They sat in peaceful silence, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had become as familiar to Catherine as Boston's harbor once was. The harsh frontier that had initially overwhelmed her now felt like the foundation for something more meaningful than anything her previous life had offered. Catherine, Jake said carefully, I know you came here planning to fulfill a teaching contract and move on to something better. I did, she agreed, turning to study his profile in the morning light. But my definition of something better has changed considerably. How so? Better now means a place where my work matters, where I'm valued for my abilities rather than my social connections, and where I can build something lasting with someone who understands both my strengths and my dreams. Jake met her eyes with an expression that mixed hope with uncertainty. Someone like a former cavalry sergeant who manages cattle and worries about keeping you safe? Someone exactly like that, Catherine replied, reaching for his hand with decision that surprised them both. Assuming he's interested in a long-term partnership with a stubborn Eastern schoolteacher who's learned to love this harsh, beautiful country. I'm interested, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. But Catherine, I can't offer you the kind of life you're accustomed to. No fancy houses or society parties or... Jake, she interrupted gently, what you can offer is infinitely more valuable. Honest work, genuine community, and the chance to build something meaningful together. That's worth more than any Boston mansion. Are you certain? He asked, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both tender and reverent. Because once you commit to this life, to this place, to me, there's no going back to what you left behind. I don't want to go back, Catherine said with absolute certainty. I want to go forward with you, building something neither of us could create alone. 6 months later, Catherine stood before her expanded classroom, watching children from 3 different ranches work together on a reading project about local history. Jake had helped her interview old-timers about the territory's development, and the students were creating a book that honored both the struggles and the achievements of frontier life. Through the window, she could see Jake working with Tom Preston and other men to build the new teacher's residence, one large enough for a family, with proper quarters for the additional teacher they hoped to recruit. Their engagement had been announced at the church social, with wedding plans for the following spring. Miss Catherine, young Sarah Jenkins called. Should we include the story about how you faced down those outlaws? Pa says that's important history too. What do you think, Sarah? Catherine replied, using the teaching method she'd developed to encourage critical thinking. What makes a story worth preserving for future generations? As her students debated the elements that made history meaningful, Catherine reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from Boston's rigid society to this frontier classroom, where education meant hope and courage meant choosing love over safety. Outside, Jake looked up from his construction work and caught her eye through the window, his smile carrying the promise of a future built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the daily choice to create something beautiful from the raw materials of frontier life.